I'm Natalie, 33 years old, and I still remember the exact moment my husband stood up in front of 20 of our closest college friends and announced our divorce before he'd even told me it was coming. We were 3 drinks into our 10-year reunion dinner, laughter still echoing around the table, when Ethan tapped his glass and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think it's time I finally said this out loud. Natalie and I are separating." Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever had your own idea taken from you by someone who was supposed to love you. Hit that like button and subscribe. This story is for you. The table went silent. Someone's fork clinked against their plate. I sat there frozen, my wine glass halfway to my lips, staring at a man I had been married to for 8 years, hearing about the end of our marriage at the same moment as everyone else in the room. 10 years since graduation, Ethan continued, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed, the same confident tone he used in every product pitch I'd ever watched him rehearse in our living room. And look at us. Marcus just made partner. Priya's launching her 3rd company. I just got promoted to Chief Technology Officer. He paused, letting his gaze land on me with something that looked almost like pity. And Natalie's still figuring out what she wants to do with her life. I think, honestly, that says everything about why this isn't working. I felt every eye at that table shift toward me, 20 faces I'd known since I was 22 years old, watching me be reduced, in a single sentence, to the one person in the room who hadn't accomplished anything. Nobody at that table knew I'd spent the last 3 years quietly building something in the evenings after my consulting contracts ended, coding late into the night at our kitchen table while Ethan slept upstairs, certain I was simply working on one of my little projects. They had no idea, laughing along nervously to smooth over the tension, that the little project Ethan had glanced at exactly once months earlier, calling it cute before returning to his phone, was a fully built personal finance application I had spent 3 years developing, quietly filed for copyright protection under my own name, and was, at that very moment, the exact product Ethan was preparing to pitch to investors under his own company's name in 9 days. I stood up slowly from that table, smoothed the front of my dress, and did not cry. I looked at Ethan, then at the 20 stunned faces around us, and said only one sentence before I walked out of that restaurant alone. "You have no idea what you just did, Ethan." Ethan and I met 11 years ago in a computer science seminar at Boston University, back when he was the charismatic, endlessly confident guy who always had an idea for the next big thing, and I was the quieter student in the back row who actually finished the assignments while he talked about theirs. I used to find that contrast charming back then. I told myself his big talk simply hadn't caught up yet to his big ambitions, and that patience was something I could offer him while he found his footing. We got married 2 years after graduation, and for the first several years, our life together felt genuinely collaborative. I worked as a freelance software consultant, taking contract projects that let me build a flexible, if inconsistent, income, while Ethan climbed steadily through product management roles at increasingly larger tech companies. I never minded the unevenness of our careers. I liked the freedom my consulting work gave me, the late nights spent building things purely because I found them interesting, without needing anyone's approval to justify the hours. It was during one of those late nights, nearly 4 years ago, that I first started sketching the earliest version of what would eventually become Ledger, a personal finance application designed around a specific philosophy I'd developed after years of watching friends struggle with overly complicated budgeting tools. I wanted something simple, almost meditative, that helped people understand their spending patterns emotionally, not just numerically. I built the first working prototype over 8 months, testing it quietly with a small group of friends who gave me honest, occasionally brutal feedback. I remember showing an early version to Ethan one night, nervous and excited in a way I hadn't felt about my own work in years. He glanced at my laptop screen for maybe 90 seconds, scrolling through a few sample screens, before handing it back to me. "It's cute," he said, already reaching for his phone. "Simple stuff. You should think bigger, Nat. This industry moves fast." I remember the specific sting of that dismissal, the way it made me quietly decide, without fully realizing it at the time, to stop sharing my progress with him so openly. Over the following 3 years, I continued building Ledger almost entirely in private, refining its design, expanding its features, filing formal copyright registration for the application's source code and design under my own name 18 months in, a step I took not out of any particular suspicion, but simply because a mentor from an old consulting project had once advised me, offhandedly, that protecting original creative work early was simply good practice. Ethan, meanwhile, had moved into a senior product role at a well-funded fintech startup, a company that had, over the past year, begun aggressively pursuing a new consumer-facing product line focused on, coincidentally, personal finance management. He talked about it constantly at dinner, describing vague, high-level concepts he was workshopping with his product team, concepts that sounded, though I didn't initially connect the dots, strikingly similar to conversations we'd had years earlier about my own early prototype, back when he still occasionally asked, dismissively, how the budgeting thing was coming along. I had no idea, sitting across from him at countless dinners over those months, listening to him describe his team's breakthrough concept with growing excitement, that the very application I had built quietly, patiently, entirely on my own time, was about to become the centerpiece of the biggest pitch of his career, presented to investors as though it had never belonged to anyone but him. 6 months before the reunion dinner, Ethan came home unusually late one night, energized in a way I hadn't seen from him in years, talking rapidly about a major pivot his company's board had just approved. His startup was shifting its entire product roadmap to focus on a new consumer finance app, one he described in increasingly specific detail over the following weeks, an emotionally intuitive interface, a philosophy built around understanding spending patterns rather than simply tracking them, a simplified onboarding flow that removed the intimidating complexity of competitor apps. I remember sitting across from him at our kitchen table one night, listening to him describe a specific screen layout, and feeling a cold, creeping recognition I couldn't quite name yet. It sounded almost identical to a wireframe I had sketched over a year earlier, one I had shown him briefly during an early design phase, back before I'd stopped sharing my progress so openly. I told myself it was coincidence. Personal finance apps, after all, weren't an unusual category, and simplicity was hardly a proprietary concept. I didn't yet understand how deliberately, how systematically, Ethan had been mining our old conversations, our shared laptop occasionally left open on the kitchen counter, and a handful of casual conversations with mutual friends who had tested early versions of Ledger to reconstruct a strikingly similar product under his company's name. What I would only discover much later, piecing together timelines with the help of my cousin Priya after everything unraveled, was that Ethan had begun documenting market research notes in a private company file nearly 8 months earlier, notes that included several screenshots I recognized instantly from Ledger's actual interface, screenshots he could only have obtained from my personal laptop. During a period I now remembered him occasionally borrowing it, just for a minute to check something while his own charged in another room. Ethan's company, a fintech startup called Vantage Financial, had been quietly preparing for a major Series B funding round, one dependent almost entirely on demonstrating a compelling, differentiated new product to secure continued investor confidence after a disappointing previous quarter. Ethan, as the newly appointed Chief Technology Officer, had positioned himself as the visionary architect behind this breakthrough product, the centerpiece of his own career advancement within the company, a story that required, structurally, that no other originator exist. I didn't know, sitting through that painful reunion dinner 3 weeks later, listening to Ethan dismiss an entire decade of my own quiet, careful work in front of 20 former classmates, that Vantage Financial's Investor Demo Day presentation had already been scheduled for 9 days later, a high-profile event where Ethan intended to unveil the very application built from my own late nights at that kitchen table, presented publicly for the first time as his singular achievement. Standing outside that restaurant after walking out alone, I didn't yet understand the full scale of what had quietly been built against me. All I understood was that my husband had just humiliated me in front of everyone we once considered family, calling me unaccomplished while preparing to claim, as his own crowning achievement, the one thing I had actually accomplished entirely on my own. My cousin Priya, an intellectual property attorney who had helped several independent developers protect their work over the years, answered her phone before the first ring finished. "Natalie, slow down. Tell me exactly what he said his company's new product does," she said, already reaching for a notepad before I'd finished the sentence. Priya arrived at my apartment within the hour, laptop already open before she'd fully settled onto my couch, pulling up the copyright registration records I had filed 18 months earlier, without ever imagining I'd need them for anything beyond routine legal protection. She scrolled through the filing details methodically, cross-referencing dates, application descriptions, and the specific source code registration number attached to ledger. "This is registered under your name alone, dated well over a year before Ethan's company began developing anything similar," she said, turning her screen toward me. "That timestamp alone is significant. But I want to understand exactly what Vantage Financial is claiming publicly before we go further. Do you have any documentation of what Ethan's actually shown investors so far?" I didn't, not directly, but I remembered enough fragments from his increasingly detailed dinner conversations to sketch out a rough description for Priya, who listened carefully, occasioning me to ask precise, specific questions about interface details, feature names, the exact language Ethan had used to describe the product's emotional intelligence approach to budgeting, a phrase I recognized instantly as one I had coined myself, written directly into Ledger's original design documentation years earlier. "That phrase is unusual enough that it's unlikely to be coincidental," Priya said, making a note. "Natalie, I think we need to see Vantage's actual pitch materials before their demo day, not just second-hand descriptions from dinner conversations. Do you have access to anything on your shared devices that might show more concrete evidence?" I thought back, slowly, to the nights Ethan had borrowed my laptop, just for a minute, moments I'd barely registered as significant at the time, distracted by my own late-night work sessions. I logged into my laptop's activity history that evening, something I'd never had reason to check before, and found with a sinking, sickening clarity, a series of screen recording sessions initiated during exactly the windows I remembered him borrowing the device, each one capturing extended scrolls through Ledger's interface, its settings menus, its onboarding flow, recorded silently while I assumed he was simply checking email. Priya reviewed the recordings with the same careful, methodical focus she brought to everything, cross-referencing timestamps against the market research notes file she had, through a former colleague working adjacent to Vantage's investor relations team, managed to obtain a partial, publicly circulated summary of the kind of preliminary materials companies sometimes shared with early interested investors ahead of a formal pitch. "Natalie, this isn't ambiguous," she said finally, closing her laptop with a quiet, controlled precision. "The screen recordings match, almost frame for frame, several of the interface descriptions in Vantage's own preliminary investor materials. This isn't parallel development. This is direct, documented appropriation of your registered intellectual property. I sat with that confirmation for a long moment, feeling something shift inside me that had nothing to do with the reunion dinner humiliation anymore, and everything to do with a colder, more focused clarity. What happens now? Now, Priya said, we need to understand exactly how much is riding on this demo day for Ethan personally, because that will determine our strategy. If this is simply an internal product decision, we could resolve this quietly through a cease and desist and licensing negotiation. But if he's staked his entire promotion, his credibility with the board, on presenting this as his singular achievement in 9 days. He has, I said quietly. He told the entire table at dinner, this is his big moment. Priya's expression sharpened into something I recognized from years of watching her prepare for difficult cases. Then we need to make sure we're in that room when he presents it. Priya spent the following days quietly building a case file, treating the situation with the same rigor she would apply to any high-stakes intellectual property dispute, despite the personal nature of the parties involved. She reached out to a forensic technology expert she'd worked with previously, someone who could formally authenticate the screen recordings and cross-reference them against Vantage Financial's preliminary investor materials with a level of technical precision that would hold up if the matter ever escalated into formal litigation. I want to be thorough before we approach anyone, Priya explained during our second strategy session, spreading printed comparisons across my dining table. If we move too early, or too aggressively, Ethan's company could simply argue independent development, especially if they've made any modifications to the interface. We need documentation precise enough that argument becomes impossible. The forensic analysis, completed within 4 days, confirmed what Priya had already suspected. Not only did the screen recordings align precisely with Vantage's preliminary materials, but the source code registered under my copyright filing contained several unique structural elements, small design choices in how the application processed and categorized transaction data that had been replicated with enough specificity in Vantage's development documentation to rule out coincidental similarity entirely. This is about as clean a case as I've seen, the forensic expert told us during a call, his tone carrying the same careful precision Priya had modeled throughout the process. The unique variable naming conventions alone would be difficult to explain as independent development. Combined with the screen recording timestamps, this isn't a gray area. While Priya continued building the technical case, I quietly reached out to a former consulting client, a woman named Odessa Marsh, who had left our early beta testing group to become a senior associate at a venture capital firm entirely unconnected to Vantage Financial's investors. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, but she remembered Ledger fondly, having been one of my earliest and most enthusiastic testers. "Natalie, I had no idea you were still developing this," she said when I finally explained the situation, careful to keep the conversation factual rather than emotional. "I still have some of my original feedback emails from testing your prototype, with screenshots you sent me for review. If that's useful documentation, I'm happy to share it." Odessa's emails, dated nearly 2 years before Vantage Financial had begun any documented development on their competing product, added another crucial layer of independent, third-party verification to the timeline Priya was assembling. Combined with my original copyright filing, the forensic screen recording analysis, and now outside verification from someone with no personal stake in the outcome, Priya's case file had grown from a private grievance into something considerably more formidable. "We have more than enough to pursue a formal infringement claim," Priya told me during our final planning session, before Vantage Financial's demo day, now just 5 days away. But Natalie, I think there's a more strategic path available here, one that protects your rights just as thoroughly while ensuring the truth reaches exactly the people Ethan built his entire narrative in front of. She explained her plan carefully, outlining how she had already identified a formal avenue for us to attend Vantage's investor presentation directly, through a colleague who sat on the board of one of the smaller venture funds expected to attend. Ethan built the perfect stage to launch his career on top of your work, Priya said, closing her folder with quiet finality. We're simply going to make sure that same stage reveals exactly who built what he's about to claim as his own. Priya insisted we approach the final days before demo day with the same careful discipline she applied to every high-stakes case. We don't confront Ethan beforehand, she told me over coffee 3 days before the event. If he suspects anything is coming, he'll postpone the presentation, quietly rebrand the interface, maybe even settle privately before investors ever see the full picture. Right now, he thinks this is simply the biggest moment of his career. That confidence is the only advantage working in our favor. It took everything in me not to call Ethan directly and confront him with everything Priya and the forensic expert had uncovered. Every instinct told me to stop this immediately, to protect 3 years of quiet, patient work before it could be presented to a room full of investors as someone else's singular vision. But the same careful patience that had carried me through years of late nights building Ledger, one small feature at a time, told me Priya was right. Rushing now would only give Ethan room to maneuver his way around what was coming. "What do you need from me?" I asked her. "Continue exactly as you have been," Priya said. "Say nothing to Ethan. Let him believe you're simply processing the reunion dinner privately, exactly as devastated and passive as he assumes you are." She slid a folder across the table containing the copyright registration, the forensic analysis, Odessa's verified early testing emails, and a formal notice of infringement drafted and ready to file the moment we needed it. We're not walking into that demo day to make a scene. We're walking in to present facts no investor in that same week. Priya's contact on the smaller venture fund's board, a measured, sharp-eyed woman named Bianca Ferreira, confirmed our attendance as observers under a technicality Priya had arranged, listing us as representatives reviewing a separate intellectual property matter unrelated, on paper, to Vantage Financial specifically. "I have to be honest with you," Bianca told Priya during their final call, which I listened to on speaker. Vantage has been positioning this app as their signature pivot for the entire fund community. If what you're describing is accurate, several firms in that room are about to make investment decisions based on a story that isn't true. I think it's important the full picture reaches them before any commitments are finalized, not after. Priya thanked her carefully, professional and measured as always, though I could hear something like quiet vindication beneath her tone once the call ended. "That's better positioning than we could have engineered ourselves," she said. An independent board member, already skeptical, already planning to attend, now aware something significant might surface. "Natalie, we're not just walking into that demo day with documentation anymore. We're walking in with a room already primed to ask the right questions." The morning of the presentation arrived with a strange, deliberate stillness. I stood in front of my closet for a long time before choosing a simple charcoal blazer, nothing that announced itself, nothing that gave away what I understood was coming. Priya had been very specific about that detail, just as she had with every other part of the plan. "We're not there to humiliate him in front of a room full of strangers," she reminded me as we gathered the folder one final time. We're there to make sure the truth about who built this becomes impossible for anyone in that room to overlook. Vantage Financial's demo day took place in a glass-walled event space on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise, the kind of venue designed specifically to make founders feel like they were already standing among the successful. Rows of investors filled sleek black chairs facing a raised stage, name cards marking reserved seats for representatives of a dozen venture funds, while a large screen behind the podium displayed Vantage Financial's logo in clean, confident lettering. Priya and I arrived 20 minutes early, checking in under Bianca's fund as observing associates, a technicality that placed us near the back corner of the room, close enough to see clearly, far enough to remain unnoticed among the crowd of investors and Vantage employees mingling before the presentations began. Ethan took the stage first among the company's leadership team, dressed in a fitted navy suit, radiating the same easy, rehearsed confidence I remembered from countless product pitches he'd practiced in our living room over the years. He opened with Vantage Financial's quarterly performance, walking investors smoothly through growth metrics and market positioning, before finally arriving at the moment I knew, with a cold certainty, he had been building toward his entire career. Today, I'm incredibly proud to unveil the product I've spent the last year personally developing, Ethan announced, the screen behind him shifting to display Ledger's unmistakable interface, rebranded under a new name, Clarity, but structurally, visually, unmistakably the same application I had built alone at our kitchen table. This represents a completely new philosophy in personal finance technology, one built around emotional intelligence, rather than simple transaction tracking. I watched Priya's expression remain perfectly neutral beside me, though I felt her hand tighten slightly around the folder in her lap as Ethan continued describing, in specific, familiar detail, features and design philosophies lifted directly from years of my own private documentation. Bianca, seated 3 rows ahead, turned slightly in her chair, glancing back toward us with a small, deliberate nod. Ethan continued for several more minutes, walking through user testimonials from an internal beta group, projected revenue estimates, and a confident closing statement about finally building something the industry has never seen before. The room applauded politely as he stepped back from the podium, visibly pleased, scanning the crowd with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had just secured his future. As the moderator opened the floor for investor questions, Bianca raised her hand first, her voice carrying clearly and evenly across the room. "I have a question about the product's origin," she said. "Mr. Whitfield, you described this as something you personally developed over the past year. Can you walk us through the technical development timeline in more detail, specifically who authored the original codebase?" Ethan's confident expression flickered, just slightly, a hesitation so brief most of the room likely missed it. "Our product team collaborated closely over the past year to build Clarity from the ground up," he said smoothly, recovering quickly. "I led that development process personally." "That's interesting," Bianca said, opening a folder of her own, "because I have documentation here suggesting the underlying codebase was registered under copyright protection nearly 3 years ago, under an entirely different name, by someone who isn't currently listed anywhere on Vantage Financial's development team." A ripple of uneasy movement passed through the investors seated nearby, phones beginning to rise throughout the room. Ethan's eyes swept the crowd, searching for some explanation, before landing directly on the back corner where Priya and I sat. Priya rose slowly, straightening her blazer, and stepped toward the ale microphone that had been set up for questions. "I think," she said, her voice calm and carrying clearly across the silent room, This room deserves to hear from the actual developer before anyone finalizes an investment decision today. Every head in the room turned as I followed Priya toward the front, feeling the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes tracking my movement across the polished floor, the same crushing scrutiny I remembered from that reunion dinner weeks earlier. Except this time, I understood exactly what I was walking toward instead of fleeing from it. Ethan's confident stage presence cracked visibly the moment he recognized me, his hand gripping the edge of the podium, as though it might steady something inside him that had just come loose. "Natalie," he said, his voice unsteady over the microphone, "what are you doing here?" "I was invited," I said calmly, stepping up beside Priya near the easel microphone. Or more precisely, my attorney was invited, as an observer representing a separate intellectual property matter directly relevant to what's currently being presented on that screen behind you. The room's energy sharpened instantly, the earlier polite applause replaced by a focused, uneasy silence. Bianca remained standing, her expression calm but unmistakably pointed. "Mr. Whitfield, I think it's important this room understands exactly what's being alleged here before we continue." Priya stepped forward, opening her folder with the same unhurried precision she'd used at my dining table weeks earlier. 3 years ago, my client, Natalie Reyes, registered copyright protection for a personal finance application called Ledger, including its complete source code and interface design, she said. The application currently being presented as Clarity shares identical structural code elements, matching design, philosophy language, and, as forensic analysis will confirm, screen recordings taken directly from Ms. Reyes's personal device during a period when Mr. Whitfield had access to it. A collective murmur spread through the investors, several already pulling out phones to search the copyright filing Priya referenced. Ethan's face had gone pale, his earlier polished composure entirely abandoned. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice rising with visible desperation. "Natalie and I were married. We built ideas together constantly. This kind of overlap happens naturally between people who share a life. Sharing conversations about an idea," Priya said evenly, "is not the same as recording someone's private screen without their knowledge and replicating their registered intellectual property under a different name. Especially when the copyright filing predates your company's development timeline by nearly 2 years." A senior partner from one of the larger venture funds in attendance, a stern-looking man named Douglas Kim, leaned forward from his seat near the front. "Mr. Whitfield, are you telling this room that Vantage Financial holds full, undisputed rights to this technology?" Ethan hesitated, just a fraction too long, his eyes darting toward the company's CEO seated in the front row, whose expression had shifted from confusion into something considerably colder. "I built the version you're seeing today," Ethan finally said, his voice tightening, "whatever early inspiration came from." "Inspiration doesn't require screen recordings of someone else's private device," I said quietly, stepping fully into view beside Priya for the first time. "I have the copyright registration, dated 3 years ago. I have independent testing records from a beta group unaffiliated with either of us, dated 2 years before your company began any documented development. And I have forensic verification of the screen recordings taken from my laptop, matching, frame for frame, the interface you just presented as your own personal achievement." The room fell into a heavy silence. Vantage Financial's CEO stood slowly from his front row seat, his expression unreadable as he turned first toward Ethan, then toward the projected screen still displaying Clarity's interface behind him. "Ethan," he said, his voice carrying a controlled, dangerous calm. "I need you to explain right now exactly whose intellectual property this company just presented to every major investor in this room." The room remained utterly silent, waiting, as Ethan stood frozen at the podium, his earlier confident posture collapsing into something visibly smaller. Douglas Kim glanced toward Vantage Financial's CEO, his expression sharpening with the particular focus of an investor calculating exactly how much exposure his fund had narrowly avoided. "I want full transparency. Right now," the CEO said, stepping toward the stage himself, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "Ethan, did you or did you not develop the core codebase presented here today?" Ethan's hands gripped the podium tighter. "I built the version of the product our team has been iterating on this year," he said, his voice noticeably smaller than it had been minutes earlier. "The original concept may have had some inspiration from your wife's registered, copyrighted application," Priya finished for him, sliding a printed copy of the forensic analysis toward Douglas Kim and several nearby investors who leaned forward to examine it. "One she built entirely independently, over 3 years, documented through consistent development records, third-party testing feedback, and formal copyright protection filed well before Vantage Financial began any work on a comparable product." Bianca spoke again from her seat, her tone measured but unmistakably pointed. "I'd like it noted, for the benefit of every fund in this room, that we are being asked to evaluate an investment opportunity built on intellectual property that appears to have been misappropriated from a private individual, without her knowledge or consent, through unauthorized access to her personal device." The CEO turned back toward Ethan, his expression hardening into something that had clearly moved past confusion into genuine anger. "You told this board personally that this technology was developed entirely in-house. You told me, specifically, that there were no ownership complications." His voice dropped lower, though it still carried across the silent room. "Do you understand what you've just done to this company's credibility? In front of every major fund, we've spent a year courting." Ethan didn't answer. He simply stood at the podium, staring out at a room full of investors who had, moments earlier, been prepared to fund his career-defining achievement, now watching him with the same cold, evaluating expressions Priya had trained me to expect from people who valued outcomes over loyalty. Douglas Kim closed the folder in front of him and stood, addressing the room generally rather than any individual on stage. "I think it's clear this presentation cannot proceed as planned. I'd recommend Vantage Financial withdraw this product from consideration entirely until ownership is fully and independently resolved." Several other investors nodded in visible agreement, phones still raised, capturing a moment that I understood, even standing in the middle of it, would likely circulate through the same tightly connected investment community for months to come. Ethan remained at the podium, silent, watching the collapse of the presentation he had spent nearly a year building his entire career around. As the room began to stir with murmured conversations and investors gathering their things, Vantage Financial's CEO approached me directly, extending his hand with an expression of genuine, if uncomfortable, respect. "Ms. Reyes," he said, "I owe you a serious apology on behalf of this company, and I intend to make sure that apology comes with appropriate formal action." I shook his hand, feeling something settle inside me that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with finally standing, publicly, as exactly what I had always quietly been, the person who actually built this. "I think," I said quietly, glancing once, briefly, at Ethan, still standing motionless at the podium, "that's a good place to start." Vantage Financial formally withdrew Clarity from its product lineup within a week of the demo day collapse, issuing a public statement acknowledging unresolved intellectual property concerns, without naming me directly, though industry publications quickly connected the details themselves. The company's Series B round, once considered nearly guaranteed, stalled entirely, with two of the larger funds in attendance formally withdrawing their interest within days, citing governance concerns beyond the product dispute itself. Ethan was quietly removed from his Chief Technology Officer role within a month, the company choosing a private, face-saving departure rather than a public termination, though everyone in that industry circle understood exactly what had happened. Priya finalized a formal settlement on my behalf shortly afterward, one that included both financial compensation for the unauthorized use of my intellectual property and a legally binding acknowledgement of my sole ownership of the original codebase, fully protecting Ledger's future from any further disputed claims. Our divorce, which Ethan had announced so publicly at that reunion dinner, finalized quietly in the months that followed, absent any of the confident narrative he had once tried to build around it. He reached out twice during that period, each time attempting some version of an explanation I no longer had much interest in hearing, framing his actions as a moment of career pressure rather than a deliberate, sustained decision to erase months of my private work from its own history. I used the settlement, along with the growing interest Ledger had unexpectedly attracted following the very public collapse of Vantage's presentation, to formally launch the application independently, working with a small, careful team I assembled myself over the following year. Odessa, my former beta tester turned venture associate, became one of my earliest angel investors, joking often that she'd never expected her old feedback emails to become such pivotal legal documentation. Bianca's fund eventually became one of Ledger's official investors as well, a decision she told me, during our first formal meeting together, felt like closing a loop she hadn't expected to personally witness the beginning of. Douglas Kim's fund followed shortly after, citing, in his own words, a level of documented founder integrity that's increasingly rare in this industry. Priya remained closely involved throughout that first year, both as my attorney and, increasingly, as one of my closest friends, still occasionally reminding me, half-joking, that she remained available for round 2, if anyone ever again tried to claim my work as their own. I think about that reunion dinner sometimes, not with the same raw humiliation I felt sitting frozen at that table, but with a strange, hard-earned clarity I never expected to find on the other side of it. Ethan spent years believing that confidence alone determined whose story got told, never once considering that the quiet, patient work happening in the margins of our marriage might eventually speak louder than anything he ever said out loud. I sat with that thought for a long time before finally understanding the truest lesson of everything I had built, and everything I had survived. 2 years have passed since I sat frozen at that reunion dinner table, hearing about the end of my marriage in front of 20 people I hadn't spoken to in years. Ledger now serves over 400,000 active users, having grown steadily through the same patient, careful development philosophy I brought to it from the very beginning, the same philosophy Ethan once dismissed, across our kitchen table, as simply cute. Ethan works now at a considerably smaller startup, according to the occasional update that reaches me through mutual industry contacts, having spent the better part of a year rebuilding a professional reputation that the demo day collapse permanently altered. I don't think about him often, though when I do, it arrives with a strange, quiet clarity rather than lingering anger, understanding now how easily confidence can be mistaken for substance, until the moment substance is finally demanded of it. Priya sits on Ledger's advisory board, still occasionally reviewing contracts with the same unhurried precision she brought to my dining table that very first night, still teasing me sometimes about the exact moment my hands stopped shaking during that démodé confrontation and my voice started carrying clearly across a room full of strangers deciding, in real time, who deserved to be believed. Odessa remains one of my closest friends and earliest investors, still occasionally pulling up her old beta testing emails during company meetings, half as a joke, half as a genuine reminder to the rest of our team of exactly how long patient, unglamorous work can take to finally be recognized. I built a new life over these past 2 years, one considerably quieter than the reunion dinner spectacle that once tried to define me, filled instead with the steady, unremarkable satisfaction of building something real, one careful decision at a time. I moved into a small apartment near my old university, close enough to walk past the building where Ethan and I first met, though these days, the memory carries far less weight than it once did. I think about that dinner far less often now, and when I do, it's with something closer to quiet gratitude than lingering pain. My marriage spent years teaching me, without ever intending to, that being underestimated by someone who valued confidence over substance was never actually a weakness. It simply meant he never looked closely enough to notice what I had actually built, quietly and carefully, long before he ever needed a reason to take it seriously. I am not the woman that dinner table once tried to define as unaccomplished. I never was. I was simply the one who had been building something real the entire time, patiently enough to still be standing there, 3 years later, when the truth finally needed defending. If you've ever had your work, your worth, or your quiet dedication dismissed by someone who never truly understood what you were building, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this journey meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are more stories like this one still